Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be impartially breaking down a completely fascinating and honestly, a highly provocative survival strategy. We are digging into a text by Coach De Bruyne's called The Madina Blueprint, Rebuilding Communal Strength and Justice. Now, whether you end up agreeing with the author's conclusions or not, you've got to admit, this is a genuinely captivating read. De Bruyne isn't just writing some theoretical pie-in-the-sky essay here. He is outlining a complete, alternative survival strategy for localized communities in a time that he views as being right on the brink of total collapse.
To really wrap our heads around this blueprint, we first have to understand the incredibly high stakes the author sets up right out of the gate. He argues that modern Muslim communities are currently facing literal existential threats. He specifically points to drones picking people apart in Gaza and crushing sanctions starving entire neighborhoods in Yemen. So for De Bruyne, rebuilding a tight-knit, localized community, it's not just some nice utopian idea. In his eyes, it is quite literally the last line of defense against global erasure.
And the apocalyptic urgency of this text is practically jumping off the page right from the start. He actually frames this entire work as a message to the future, like a survival guide for generations yet to come who are dealing with the fallout of societal collapse. He calls his own era a disgraceful time, simply because communities lost the basic ability to defend themselves. He's practically pleading with the reader, saying, "Don't be like us, make new mistakes." It is a heavy, super dramatic hook, and it absolutely sets the tone for everything we're about to cover.
So what exactly is the Madina Blueprint? Well, De Bruyne defines it not as some museum piece or a historical artifact that you just admire from a distance. No, this is meant to be a modern, highly actionable survival strategy. He wants to take the original collectivist building blocks of the very first Muslim community in early Medina and apply them directly to solve modern geopolitical and social crises. And the reason this matters for us today is that he's not just giving us a history lesson. This is his proposed architectural model for tomorrow.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll be unpacking 5 key pillars. 1. Reclaiming the Madina model. 2. Rethinking prayer and culture. 3. Matchmaking and gender dynamics. 4. The duty of defense. And finally, grassroots governance and justice. Let's get right into it.
Starting us off with Section 1, Reclaiming the Madina Model.
The author builds his entire argument on the premise that modern Islamic societies are fundamentally broken at a structural level, and honestly, they require a complete, ground-up overhaul. He points out that today, communities stop at what he calls family tribalism. People are marrying their first cousins because they simply don't trust the broader community around them. He also claims modern believers constantly conflate regional Arab culture with universal Islam. He says they perform empty religious rituals without actually connecting to their neighbors, they trade martial readiness for lazy comfort, and they unnecessarily ban cultural expressions like song and dance. Basically, he asserts that this kind of hyper-conservatism and tribalism leads straight to internal divisions rather than true Islamic brotherhood.
Moving right along to Section 2, Rethinking Prayer and Culture.
So how do we fix this issue of passive religious rituals and cultural erasure? Well, he draws a really stark contrast between empty ritual and actual vibrant communal prayer. De Bruyne argues that in modern mosques, people just show up, fidget with their watches, completely ignore the person standing right next to them, and just remain inwardly materialistic. His proposed solution, mosques should be active centers of education and connection. He suggests that communities should sit down together after early evening prayers to actually study Quran translations and preach real accountability and collectivism, rather than just going through the physical motions of prayer in total isolation.
And this ties directly into his views on culture. The source text strongly emphasizes that becoming Muslim absolutely does not mean you have to adopt Gulf Arab cultural exports. He argues that universal Islam was historically designed to tolerate and adapt to indigenous cultures. In fact, he actively advocates for localized cultural events, stuff like sanitized song, dance, and local sports, because, as he puts it, they provide a healthy, lawful avenue for escapism. He warns that if a community just bans all cultural entertainment outright, people are inevitably going to seek it out anyway, but in underground, much more harmful environments.
All right, let's pivot to Section 3, Matchmaking and Gender Dynamics.
Now, this is where De Bruyne tackles how a community integrates and actually continues into the next generation. And he makes a really fascinating historical distinction here. He contrasts Bedouin conservatism with what he calls cosmopolitan Medina. According to the author, the strict hiding of women in early Bedouin culture was just a practical survival necessity due to the constant threat of desert raids, literally, men stealing each other's wives.
But he argues the Prophet's Medina was completely different. It was a metropolis, it was a cosmopolitan culture where visible, supervised mixing and courtship in the marketplace were entirely natural and safe because that threat of raids just wasn't there. He claims that over time we've accidentally hard-coded Bedouin survival tactics into universal religious law.
Which brings us to a highly provocative claim from the text. And remember, we're just impartially reporting his argument here. De Bruyne asserts that extreme, unnatural segregation actually fuels hidden vices. He argues that forcing absolute separation prevents natural, lawful human desires from being met in a healthy way, which ends up driving people toward behaviors they wouldn't otherwise engage in. He believes historical Islam was much more realistic, far less prudish, and actively encouraged men and women to see and know each other in society to facilitate marriage.
So his blueprint solution for this is pretty straightforward, but definitely radical. Community-wide and even intercommunity matchmaking events. He envisions these highly public, visible environments where single men and women can interact to foster strong marriages. Why do this? Well, to diversify the gene pool, sure, but also to bypass a system he claims is deeply oppressive, incredibly expensive dowries that basically price out average young men. It's a radical solution to modern financial gatekeeping, designed to stop a handful of wealthy men from hoarding all the marriages.
Let's dive into Section 4, the duty of defense.
Entering the physical and defensive pillar of the blueprint, the author takes on a noticeably more militant tone, and he poses this incredibly blunt question. Is prayer enough to sustain a community? He uses this to tee up a very controversial stance on the hierarchy of religious duties when a community is staring down violent external opposition. De Bruyne asserts that fighting for justice actually supersedes prayer and charity. To illustrate this point, he compares a person who prays for their own individual soul for 5 minutes a day to a figure like Nelson Mandela, who sacrificed 27 years of his life fighting for the dignity and justice of his people. The author argues that God infinitely prefers the one who sacrifices their entire life for justice over the one who merely performs safe, isolated rituals while their community is being destroyed.
Because of this worldview, his blueprint mandates extreme, across-the-board military readiness. We're talking about a society with mandatory martial arts, serious investment in community military schools, and war games utilizing modern tech. He calls for compulsory military training for every single able-bodied man. Yes, even during times of absolute peace. He argues that greedy forces are always going to want to crush successful, faithful communities. Therefore, peace for believers is only actually possible if it is premised on overwhelming, unassailable strength.
And finally, Section 5, Grassroots Governance and Justice.
So how does this theoretical community actually fund and police itself, independent of a failing central state? Well, the author provides a very clear, heavily anti-globalist rationale for his system. He believes that central governments are inevitably going to collapse because they serve globalist wealth, not local well-being. Therefore, localized grassroots governance isn't just some nice preference for him. He sees it as the only viable way to avoid the bribery, exploitation, and ultimate collapse of modern bureaucratic state systems.
The community fund he proposes relies on a tightly controlled three-step cycle. First, mandatory contributions of either money or labor. And he means it. If you're poor, you still contribute, even if that means guarding cars in the lot or mopping the community hall floors. Second, those contributions fund independent, localized services like clinics, schools, and local policing. Third, strict accountability. If you refuse to contribute, you instantly lose all access to these services. It's a harsh boundary, for sure, but in his view, it's absolutely necessary to prevent the collapse of the entire social project.
Lastly, he outlines the justice system. He contrasts the incredibly time-consuming, deeply bureaucratic nature of state courts, where a person's life can literally be put on hold for a decade over minor dispute, with his proposed localized community courts. These local courts would handle civil disputes and petty crimes swiftly. And because they are localized, they can lean heavily on cultural context, utilizing leniency and mercy for minor mishaps, and resolving issues within days rather than years.
Which leaves us with this final immense tension to reflect on. As we've seen today, the author paints a picture of a world right on the brink, arguing for total, localized self-reliance. But it forces us to ask, can modern, globalized, centralized states actually coexist with this kind of autonomous, religiously driven, militarily ready grassroots governance? Or, as the author so passionately argues, is a radical return to the Madina Blueprint truly the only way to survive the coming storm? It is a deeply provocative framework that challenges the very foundations of how our modern communities operate. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.